If you listen to Western media outlets and Western politicians, they constantly claim that China is supposedly a threat to the world because it's expanding its military spending. In fact, US President Donald Trump has repeatedly fear-mongered about China. This is a clip from his first term as president back in 2019, where he claimed that China is a threat to the world.
Obviously, China is a threat to the world in a sense because they're building a military faster than anybody.
Now, Trump's claim that China is supposedly building up its military faster than anyone is ridiculous, considering that the United States spends more on its military than the next 10 largest military spenders in the world combined. And every single year, the US is expanding its military budget, which is approaching $1 trillion per year. Now, to be fair, there are people who point out that there genuinely is a lot of fraud and corruption that goes on in the US military, and the Pentagon has failed every single audit that it has attempted. And the US military has also admitted that it can't even account for trillions of dollars of its own assets. So in that sense, it is fair to say that just because the US plows trillions of dollars into the military doesn't mean that it has the best, most effective military. But then there's also the simple fact that China has not fought a war since 1979. Meanwhile, the US government has been constantly at war for hundreds of years. In fact, according to official US government data, the US military was involved in 251 foreign interventions just from 1991 until 2022. Or, according to official US government data, the US military was involved in 469 foreign interventions between 1798 and 2022. The US military has intervened in the vast majority of countries on Earth. And yet again, China has not fought a war since 1979 in 46 years. So it's pretty obvious that when US politicians accuse China of being a so-called threat to the world, it is deeply hypocritical. But today I want to talk about another related issue, which is how the US not only has waged war around the world, but it has also fueled foreign wars through the US military-industrial complex, flooding the planet with weapons, with missiles and bombs and ammunition and tanks. In fact, the United States is by far the top arms dealer on Earth. In the past 5 years, the US was responsible for 43% of all weapons exports on Earth. The US exported over 7 times more weapons than China and over 5 times more weapons than Russia. And yet we're led to believe by Western media outlets and Western politicians that China and Russia are the ones supposedly threatening the world, whereas the US is the one flooding the world with weapons and fueling conflicts everywhere you look. This is according to data that was published in March by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is the world's leading organization tracking the global arms industry and world military spending. They found that the United States was by far the world's largest exporter of weapons, responsible for transferring 43% of all of the weapons exported from 2020 until 2024. In second place was France at 9.6%. In third place was Russia at 7.8%. In fourth place was China at 5.9%. In fifth place was Germany at 5.6%. In sixth place was Italy at 4.8%. In seventh place was the United Kingdom at 3.6%. In eighth place was Israel at 3.1%. In ninth place was Spain at 3%. And in 10th place was South Korea at 2.2%. The journalist Stephen Semler pointed out that if you use this data, you can see that the United States exports more weapons than the next 7 largest arms exporting countries combined. Steven Sandler does a lot of good data-oriented journalism and creates some really good charts. I will link to his Substack in the description below. But what's also interesting and noteworthy is to see how these weapons exports have evolved in the past 5 years. You can see that between 2020 and 2024, US weapons exports increased by 21%, and France's arms exports increased by 11%, but Russia's weapons exports actually fell by 64% in the past 5 years, and China's arms exports also decreased by 5.4%. What really sticks out from this data is that Italy has seen a massive increase in its weapons exports. In the past 5 years, Italy's weapons exports have increased by 138%. And one of the main reasons for that is that Italy became one of the top providers of weapons to Israel, especially as it was brutally bombing Gaza. Of course, the US is by far the largest supplier of weapons to Israel, representing 66% of weapons that Israel gets. Germany is the second biggest, supplying 30% of Israel's weapons imports, but Italy is the third biggest at 5%. Now, as for the biggest importers of weapons in the past 5 years, it's of course not surprising that the number one importer of weapons was Ukraine, representing 8.8% of all imports of weapons. Of course, because Ukraine has been involved in this proxy war, NATO, led by the United States and also involving European countries, has flooded Ukraine with weapons in order to fight a proxy war against Russia. But what's interesting is that Ukraine has imported more weapons than even India, which is the most populous country on earth with 1.4 billion people. And after India, the other major importers of weapons were Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Japan, Australia, Egypt, the United States, and Kuwait. Now, it's not just Ukraine that has seen a massive increase in military spending and weapons imports in the past 5 years. In fact, across Europe, we've seen the same pattern. In the past 5 years, Europe's imports of weapons more than doubled, and almost 2/3 of all of the weapons imported into Europe by members of NATO were produced by the United States. This has been a huge boon to the US military-industrial complex, with dozens of European countries spending many billions of dollars to buy weapons and ammunition from US weapons corporations. In fact, the United States was the source of more than 80% of the weapons purchased by the United Kingdom, Norway, Sweden, Italy, the Netherlands, and Montenegro. Now, this is not just because of the war in Ukraine. Now, this expanded, intensified phase of the war in Ukraine began in 2022. It actually went back to 2014 when the US backed a coup that overthrew Ukraine's geopolitically neutral government. But regardless, this is not just about Ukraine. This has been a trend that we've seen in recent years, and a lot of it has been promoted by Donald Trump. During his first term as US president from 2017 until the beginning of 2021, Trump was pressuring European members of NATO to massively expand their military budgets. Trump originally demanded that European members of NATO boost their military expenditure to 2% of GDP, and the majority actually have done so. 23 out of the 32 members of NATO now spend more than 2% of GDP on the military. And for Poland, for instance, Poland is now spending more than 4% of GDP on its military. Now, that was what Trump was saying in his first term. He's now in his second term, and he's expanded it even further and demands that European members of NATO spend 5% of their GDP on the military, which is crazy. This has led to a weapons bonanza in Europe, and the European Commission even announced that it's going to provide 150 billion euros of loans for NATO members to massively increase their military spending. And this raises the question, where are they going to buy these weapons and ammunition and tanks and such from? what country is going to produce them? Well, you can guess it. A lot of it is probably going to come from the United States, from private for-profit corporations in the U.S. military-industrial complex. So this is part of Trump's strategy. He said for decades that he wants to reduce the U.S. current account deficit, the trade deficit it has with the rest of the world. And one of the ways that Trump wants to do this is by forcing European members of NATO to massively increase the number of weapons and military equipment that they buy from the United States. Of course, he's also using tariffs and other mechanisms. But Trump says, okay, fine. You can buy a bunch of our weapons, which is going to help the U.S. economy. It's going to help U.S. weapons corporations. And in the process, it's going to be working class people in Europe who lose out. Why? Because elites in the Western financial press are calling for gutting the welfare state, gutting social spending in order to double the military budget. So U.S. capitalists in the military-industrial complex will get richer and richer, while working people in Europe are going to get poorer and poorer. This is the stated policy proposal of the Financial Times, the newspaper of the global capitalist class, the transatlantic capitalist class. They published an article titled, "Europe Must Trim Its Welfare State to Build a Warfare State." They argue that there's no way of defending the continent without cuts to social spending. So quite literally, they're going to be taking money away from elderly pensioners, retirees. They're going to take money away from children who want to get education. They're going to take money away from families whose children are at daycare, if there's daycare subsidies provided by the government. They're going to take money away from people who need health care, and they're going to send that money to U.S. weapons corporations like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman in order to make Trump and the U.S. regime happy at the expense of the working people of Europe. This is, in my opinion, an insane policy. And what really concerns me is I think this is going to lead to the rise of far-right parties all across Europe, because you're going to have these centrists and neoliberals and even the fake social democrats who are going to be giving all of this money to the U.S. military-industrial complex. And these far-right parties are going to capitalize on this. So this is a complete disaster in the making. But unfortunately, this is the world that the U.S. government is creating. A world of war, of conflict, of trillions of dollars going down the drain to spend on the military, not on social services, not on healthcare and education. As I pointed out earlier, the U.S. military budget is by far the largest in the world. The United States alone represented 37% of all of the world's military spending as of 2023. This is according to the most recent publicly available data from the same organization, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. They show that the United States spends 3 times as much on its military than China, despite the fact that China's population is 4 times larger than the U.S. population. Moreover, the U.S. spends over 8 times more on its military than Russia. Russia only represents 4.5% of global military spending. And then there's India, which represents 3.4% of global military spending. So the US spends over 10 times as much on its military than India, despite the fact that India also has 4 times the US population. And then the next largest military spenders in the world are Saudi Arabia, the UK, Germany, Ukraine, France, Japan, South Korea, Italy, Australia, Poland, and Israel. Now, I should point out that the majority of these countries are allies of the United States. So when you combine together the military spending of the United States and its allies, it represents the majority of global military spending. But we're supposed to believe that supposedly China is a threat to the world. Again, a country that has not fought a war since 1979. And by the way, I should point out that that data is based on the official numbers used by the US government for its military budget, which is in fact very conservative. Some economists have pointed out that the actual US military budget is well over $1.5 trillion, because the official US military budget, which is now approaching $900 billion, that doesn't include other military-related expenses, like, for instance, the military's medical insurance or veterans benefits, or even nuclear spending, which is actually included under the Department of Energy, or their space. The US military is now militarizing space. So when you factor in all of these other related costs, the real US military budget in 2022 was $1.54 trillion, and that increases every single year. And as I mentioned earlier, there is no indication that the Trump administration is going to be cutting the Pentagon's budget. In fact, the House of Representatives, where the Republicans have a majority, voted to increase military spending. By the way, I should point out that Elon Musk, the world's richest billionaire oligarch, has been playing a key role in the Donald Trump administration, and he created the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, and yet his DOGE has barely touched the Pentagon and the rampant fraud and corruption that goes on in the US military. According to the official number of federal government contracts that have been canceled by DOGE, US military contracts only represent 0.05% of the total. Basically nothing. It's a rounding error to zero. But hey, maybe it has something to do with the fact that Elon Musk's companies, like SpaceX, have received billions of dollars in contracts from the Pentagon. Who knows? So in short, the US military-industrial complex is going to continue to benefit from the United States flooding the world with weapons, waging wars around the world, and fueling foreign conflicts basically everywhere you look. Now, if you want to find access to the links and the sources for all of the reports and data that I cited today, in the description below, I have a link to an article over at geopoliticaleconomy.com, and you can find them for yourself. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.